Greetings, everyone. My name is Balisa Mufukeng, the co-founder of Edtech Bridges, and thank you so much for tuning in to this very important conversation in and around 30 years into democracy in South Africa. So we are looking at education as a whole, right? So as part of that, I want us to just really look into the topic for the day, which is 30 years into democracy. Let us talk education. So obviously, at the dawn of democracy, there were a lot of policies in place. There were a lot of dreams in place in as far as reimagining this new South Africa. And this transformation also speaks to the policies that are put in place, the systems that are also reenacted in as far as ensuring that we have this remuneration, as it were, right? So obviously, now that we are into the 30 years, we are met with a lot of reflections. People do reflect about democracy from the economic perspective, in as far as social development is concerned. But our focus today will be on education, the policies within basic and higher education, leadership and governance, and so on and so forth. Of this discussion, we do have our panelist. We have Bafana Mohali, who is the Executive Director of Sakim Fundo. Our second speaker who is running a bit late. Let's hope that she'll make it before we end the session. Her name is Dr. Palisa Mutabo, the Senior Director at Nelson Mandela University. And we also have our third speaker to this conversation going by the name of Irfan Mangera, and he's the Civic Alliances Coordinator with Rise Mzansi. Right, gentlemen, please turn on your mics and your camera mode. Right, let me remove that. Thank you so much and welcome to this conversation. 30 years into democracy. 30 years, 30 years. Bafana, I think just to start with you, how are you? How are you feeling? Let's just get the room and the temperature.
Very well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the invite. I'm excited to be on the platform and just to have this conversation and share my personal thoughts, academic thoughts, but I think most importantly, thoughts here that has to speak to the country and where we are in terms of education.
That is true. Irfan, yourself, how are you?
Good morning, and I'm very well. So excited to be talking education, specifically in light of 30 years of democracy, which is a very reflective moment, I think, for most South Africans who are contemplating, thinking, and trying to reimagine ahead and what the future looks like. So very excited to be here with the fellow panelists.
Thank you so much. All right, Bafana, let's just start with you, right? So in my introduction, I did mention that, you know what, when we got our independence in 1994, there were a lot of policies in place in as far as higher education is concerned, in as far as basic education is concerned. So can you please take us through these policies, if you may, and then just also reflect on the impact that they made, if any, and are there any tangible substances or changes that we can really look into, if any?
Okay, sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, but I think maybe taking from the top, just I don't think we can really speak 94 without speaking prior to 94, because really 94 was a result of, and I think, yeah, it would really be an injustice to get into the result without speaking of the cause. So really education in essence is a pivotal part of our ecosystem. But what I've come to realize is education is actually a microcosm of our society in general. You know, they speak about teachers being the ones who produce all type of professions, or teaching really being the mother of all professions. But what we find really is prior to 94, we know that we had the apartheid system that was ran really for just over 4 decades. But prior to that, we had just over 3 centuries of colonial rule. And what I've come to realize, obviously through studies, is that, the colonial rule really, came to a part stop, and didn't stop completely, but it was just really partial stop, with the apartheid system coming into effect and obviously being officiated in 1948, under the leadership of the National Party. And apartheid then brought its part into the fold, through the Afrikaners, and they instituted obviously policies and structures. But what I really want to dawn on is the fact that these systems, colonial and apartheid, were very clear
Mm,
about what they
mm,
envisaged for themselves as
mm,
a nation, as
mm,
a people. And what that looked like within the context of education was the building of educational
mm,
institutions, particularly educational institutions or higher educational institutions. And that was obviously a way in which they would then use to then penetrate the entire society, whether it was just learning of their history, which is more personal to the nation, or getting
mhm,
into professional spaces and what are we creating and what are we wanting to see, what we envisage to see.
mhm. Yes.
And I think then coming into democracy, we then merely did not change policies. But what we then did was simply to give access to people of color, giving them now access to those colonial policies, to those colonial structures, to those colonial institutions, of which we know that prior to 94, we did not have full access. So, yeah, and I think just as a launching pad, I would love to just drop it there to say 94 really became an access point, but was not really a policy change. And I'm happy to speak about the changes of the policy in a bit as well.
All right. Thank you so much for taking us through that. So what you're basically saying is that, you know what, it was a matter of saying now that the people of color we are now politically free. Basically, it meant that you just have access to the already existing systems. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you so much for that brief introduction, and we'll just have to dive more into that as well. Right. Irfan, as the Civic Alliances coordinator within Rise Mzansi, obviously you are within the governance, the leadership space, and given your history as well and your experience, you do have some form of idea and understanding in as far as leadership and governance in South Africa is concerned, right? So I'd love for you to just take us through the leadership structures, that came after 1994. You can look at this from a presidential level, ministerial level, in as far as education is concerned. So you can just choose your own leader and say, you know what, from this leader, this is how they prioritized and positioned education.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Palisa. And I want to expand because it does touch on some of the points raised just now, in that the leadership was in a transitionary space. We had to analyze that, and rightly so, that we did inherit a colonial system. The education specifically had multiple departments that in
Mm,
1994 and post 94 we had to make and construct it into one, because one of the key things that the leadership of the time provided us was that we have this constitution that allows for equitable access to education. And so I will
mm,
lead by saying that Mandela was a key figure in doing so. With his leadership at the time, you had Prof. Bengu, and you then had Prof. Kader Asmal in, I think it was 1999. And in this period of transition, the leadership they provided was to try to now bring in all these multiple departments of education, of the multiple homelands, etc., and make it into one system. As a
mm,
result, today we do have a public system, a public education system, but we also now have a growing private education system, which is a deeper worry for me. So when we speak of leadership, I think we had a really solid team at the time who was focused on the politically correct way of trying to symbolically showcase to society that the idea of unity, the idea of, or rather, the characterizing a single access point for education was possible. It was difficult terrain to navigate, and I think it didn't go on without challenges. I say this because what the education did was to provide an opportunity for all South Africans, black, white, colored, Indian, etc., to now access a common education. But in doing so, what we didn't foreground, and I think the missing link had been the quality of such an education and the dismantling of the some of the colonial attitudes that were inherited that needed to be addressed. And unfortunately, in that transitionary period, what the leadership had to do to create the equitable access was a compromise. And that compromise came about because the leadership of the unions had to be engaged, the leadership of the principals, the SGBs, the families of society, and of those within the bureaucratic models. And so you had to find that compromising space in order for us to at least attempt to do away with the apartheid curriculums and apartheid design into something that is freely accessed by all. I think for me, as it stands today, one of the longest serving has been Mam Angie Mutseka. I think in many ways she has gotten a lot of flack for her not dealing decisively on some of the things, but in some ways I think she has helped in the post-transitionary space of trying to stabilize a department that's one of the biggest in the country. I, for one, want to really give credence to teachers. I think the leadership of teachers has been phenomenal throughout, because the subsequent transitions, even if it post democracy of OBE, of CAPS, etc., the teachers have been the ones who had to bear the systemic changes that have come with the decisions of the politicians in the space. Now, the last point I want to make is that these transitions and the leadership question has, in my opinion, now is at the stalemate, because we need the system to really give a sense of life towards the vision that we have of South Africa. And unfortunately, like my brother just said, as a microcosm of society, we are merely just perpetuating the same social ills and problems we have by not having the political will to do what's right. We are still within the same framework that those within the 90s has had to develop compromise. And I think we now moved away from this compromise position to saying we need governance to work effectively so that we can deliver an equitable education for all. And should we not do that in this period, we're going to find ourselves on the back foot, because the growing private sector education will continue to grow. More of our people will want to access a quality education on that side of the fence. And your public school education will find itself less and less popular, and inadvertently, that's a danger, in my opinion, to the democratic society we're trying to build.
Right.
I mean, we can
You
go
touch
on, but I
on
want to leave it
a
there.
lot of points. I know, right? There's too much to really talk about. But thank you so much. Yes, you are highlighting the role of teachers within this space. And I think it was when UNESCO, the theme for the year was the change of education begins with teachers. So in your now view, basing it on the fact that teachers and educators played a very significant role, how important it is to adequately, develop teachers for such an education that we want? How do you think that translates to the kind of students that we want? How do you think that translates to the kind of students that we want to have in our education system? and the kind of education that we want to have. How do you think that translates to that?
So I do think that the teachers itself
Are you able
have
to
a
hear me?
very big role. Um, I can. Can you hear me?
Mm. Yes, yes.
I think I lost you for a second there. Cool. So I
You
was
can
saying, I
continue.
think within the this transformative role, we need teachers to play a more engaging role in forming policy, and there are various reforms that I think are bound to come. For us to be investing so much currently in education, we can't be seeing the rates of illiteracy that we do. And unfortunately, this is a result of bad governance, bad leadership, and of not investing in the right things. And teachers then play a massive role. I think the unions do need critique and a valid critique. I mean,
Mm.
I've come across many principals who have also given me anecdotes of how they engage with in a very corrupt practice, or at least they know others who engage in corrupt practices for hiring people for the sake of sexual activity, etc. And this kind of culture is a very damaging one. And I'm afraid that the system is being plagued by this kind of culture that is actually a detriment to good governance, a detriment to upholding the values that we want to hold in our constitution.
Mm.
I do have a problem with us in the discourse that also forgets the biggest stakeholder, and that is the stakeholder, which is the learners,
Yeah.
the learners who are engaged in school, who are engaged in different levels of schooling. I say this because on the backdrop of, I think it was last week, where some MEC spoke out against equal education, and I think for me it's a testament to the
Mm.
lack of political will we're seeing from leadership who want to create or cultivate a coherent and a cohesive environment of dialogue between different stakeholders, for a movement of learners to be told that, what do you actually bring to the space in a democracy like ours. I'd actually fight against such a thing, because it is civil society, it's NGOs,
Mm.
NPCs who've been carrying so much of the democratic change model that we have, that we must encourage more of them, because that's what our democracy has been about: participating, contributing, and being able to give our inputs. So a session like this, for example, has brought together some stakeholders, people who are in the field. But does this see the light of day within the conversation of reforms that we need to the system itself? As a leader, both within the education space at a very minimal level, to trying to now move into the actual policy reform space, I think we're finding that there is a disconnect in society. And for me, it's trying to put up leaders who are not just
Mm.
of the capability, but also who have the will of the people in mind when making decisions, and not for the benefit of themselves, but of the people of this country.
I like that, and I like how you just say, you know what, we do have this conversations. At the same time, what that means is the society that we hope to really get. So I think what is also important here is to just for us we are aware of the fact that yes, we are having these conversations, whether they reach to the top or not. I think what is important is documenting these stories so that should our generation come, at least they have a form of reference regardless of who was listening and who was not listening. So this is why we're having this very conversation here, to document it for our history such that we are able to have a very good way in. Balisa?
Hi.
Okay, I don't think she can hear me.
I
Hi,
can
how
hear
are
you.
you?
I'm good. How are you?
Discussion. Welcome.
Hi, colleague.
Yes,
Hi.
we good. Okay. I think there's a delay on my end, but yeah, it's fine.
Mm,
We just got into the conversation. At the heart of this, obviously, is a reflection on 30 years into democracy, and we are talking education. So also met with different lived experience and might have missed. So in your view now, I'd love for you to just take us through the policies, if any, that you can really allude to in as far as education in higher education rather is concerned. What transformative policies can impacted the higher institutions of learning in your view?
okay. I've missed half of that, but are you asking which policies have impacted higher education?
Yes.
Okay. I suppose I have to first start and say South Africa, compared to the rest of the continent, is very privileged. Because of already existing higher education systems. And I think those are just the inheritances of apartheid. Because universities were already built that time. We had a science system that already worked. And so I think the last 30 years really has been a big focus on increasing access, transforming, what higher education looks like. Obviously, increasing access for black people, and ensuring that Black people have access to good quality higher education, and then they come out obviously to come and have economic impact. Um, so starting with that, I think that we already started. We came into democracy with something to work with, and for the last 30 years, I can say that there has been change. Very small, but there has been change, and I think some of us have been very privileged to have had the opportunity to evolve with higher education systems, and in general, being able to evolve with the education system in South Africa. I think, I went to a Model C school in 1996. It would have been something unthinkable at the time, but I went to it because of democracy and the opportunities that started to get created. And I had the opportunity to go to a university because of bursary systems and transformative policies in universities that required that there would be it wasn't nice to be thought of, but there would be quarters where there would be Black students that would come and you get a bursary, etc. And those created pathways for some of us. So there has been change, and there has been impactful change that today somebody like me can come and sit and talk about the experiences in higher education. The last 30 years, we've seen a lot of changes in the National Research Foundation, for example, in terms of the nature of funding. We've seen the changes in NEFSAS, and the responsiveness, obviously, to some of the challenges that students have expressed. And not to say that those things are going smoothly, but they are bringing change. More and more students are getting access to come to study. More and more students are getting access to funding. More and more students are getting access to stay on, even get appointed into academic roles. But I think in terms of the policy, I would like to really focus on what the National Research Foundation has done in collaboration with the Department of Science and Innovation, as well as the Department of Higher Education and Training, and the councils on higher education, who have, put in specific policies around, retention of Black people in academia, in academic positions. The policy on funding, that introduces equity allocations for Black women, general Black people, and then women, because we know that there's challenges in higher education, no representation of Black people and women. So they've written the policies to respond to that. Excuse me. You also have policies that are focused on advancing the Black academia. So we have the Black Academic Advancements Program, which provides funding for Black academics. The funding is for you to be able to do research, to supervise students, to travel to conferences and build your collaborations, which are the networks you need to build yourself as an academic, to build a reputation. Most Black people wouldn't get a job, for example, as an academic, because it takes a long time to build the networks that people would have had. If you compare a Black man and a white male academic, you will see them. A white male would have had a long exposure, scientific capital, I call it, because you grow up, your family, people have already done PhDs before. You understand how to network in academic settings, whereas the Black guy is the first time, the first graduate, the first of everything. So there's no network there. So these kind of programs help you advance. You may see the Department of Science and Innovation has awards and recognition systems, and they've partnered with international organizations such as L'Oreal, etc. And they make it a priority to identify Black women researchers and fund them and put them on platforms, because also that creates a space, a platform to be seen, recognized, and integrated as part of this system. So these things have been going on the past 30 years, but it's going to take a lot more time for us to see the real impact of that. Excuse me, I got a bit of cough. So it's going to take a bit
No
of time
problem.
for 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 us to see even a faster change. But as things go, the beginnings are very difficult. The beginnings of change are very difficult, and then as soon as you just climb over that hill, then things go really fast. And then I'm thinking that in the next 30 years, we will see a really faster trajectory, in terms of higher education landscape changes, and who is in those environments. Yes.
Yes. Right. Thank you so much. You brought in a lot of information as far as the systems and the policies in place, as far as enriching a Black academic in the space. You're also bringing the idea of retention of Black employees, representation, right, and the importance of social and cultural capital, as it may, right. So let me just probably bring in Bafana in there to say, Palsa speaks about the policies that are in space, that are in place rather, in as far as higher education is concerned. And in your introduction, you spoke about how these literally, in terms of basic education, obviously, they brought in access for for people of color, right? Now, in your position, in terms of transformation of employees and people of color within your space, how has that been reflected?
Sure. Thank you for that, Palisa. And thanks for joining us, Dr. Palisa there. Yeah, I guess, the big thing for me is, good and well that we've got access and we do not want to take that away. And we do not want to minimize it, because really it has given a lot of people of color access into spaces that they would not ordinarily have gained access to. And today we see, a rising black middle class because of that. But I guess, for me, it's always the bigger picture. And I'm saying that, is access enough? Because even when we speak about access, how many people are actually getting access compared to how many people are not getting the access? So if we are to use, so how many Tinswalos do we have? But how many unnamed, do we have? And this doesn't take rocket science. We've got Minister Angie announcing annually an average of 1.2, 1.3 million learners enrolling in grade one. Fast track 12 years later, and every year we get then the statistics about how many learners are sitting for their matric result, matric papers. And oftentimes you have the number ranging anything between, 750,000 to 850,000, which gives us very close to 500,000 kids that are just being lost in the system, that were probably given the access in basic education, but would never, ever, ever complete, number one, because they've dropped out. And then as a result, we're saying that those kids, they are the bulk of the kids that we should be worried about. And then I'm asking, is the access really then working for us? Then going back to the policies to say, what then needs to change? Because I asked the question, why are we changing policies? Why are we reforming policies? Why are we transforming policies? And the question I ask that, the reason why I ask the question is, whose policies are these to start off with? And I started off by saying, these are still colonial and apartheid policies. Why are we changing other people's things? And the analogy I use here is that of a bicycle. If you come and borrow my bicycle, it's my bicycle. Whether it's big, whether it's small, it's my bicycle. And if it's not comfortable for you, the point is it's my bicycle. And what I'm hearing oftentimes is, let's change Bafana's bicycle, so that Palisa can enjoy it, or so that, any other child can enjoy it. And I'm saying, why don't we create a bicycle for Palisa to get to enjoy? Because we find a system here trying to change policies that is safeguarded, and because it's still working for the colonial structures, it's still working for the Afrikaners. They're still benefiting from these policies. So we need to get to a point where we create our own and alter these policies and break away from this colonial matrix of power. Because yes, we can be proud about the few, and I call them the few, that has made it, that are getting into these academic spaces, that are getting into the tertiary institutions. But my cry is the lots that you go to Soweto today, you go to townships, they are loitering the streets today. They are the ones breaking into your houses. They are the ones hijacking your cars. They are the ones standing in street corners. They are the people that the system is not working for. And all really, the access did was to create just this bimodal education system where we have, the schools that are performing very well, that are competitive globally, but we also then alternatively have the schools that are performing the worst. And when you look at the terms reports, we are either last or second last, in terms of our competencies. Grade 4 is not reading for meaning. And I'm saying that's all the current status quo has done. And as a result, we then see South Africa also then becoming the most unequal state in the world, because that's exactly what our system has done. It has created access to say, okay, if you're smart enough, you'll gain access into this other world that makes you progressive, that makes you smarter, that makes you, gain knowledge and power and. But if you're not, and if you don't make the cut, you just become on the other side and you remain on the other side. And I'm saying that, why is it that we are making this bimodal, this inequality a norm? We need to be saying that, how do we ensure that we take every African child along with us? And that's my plea. And hence, the space with one finds himself in within civil society, because we know that within our formal education structures, within basic education, and maybe even within tertiary institutions, it's a matter of maintaining and saying, how do we increase access? But I'm saying, you're busy wanting to gain access into something that is not yours. When do we come up as South African academia and say that, how do we create, as much as the colonial structures created, as much as the Afrikaners created? And we saw even with the creation of the Afrikaners, they only had just over 4 decades to create this. We are 10 years away from that 4 decades that they had. But we see the institutions they created. We see how the Stellenbosches were built. We see how the University of
Mm,
Pretoria was built to foster and to ensure that their own policies and what they have in mind for themselves really
mm,
becomes a reality. And they uplift people whom they had interest in at that particular time. My question is, have
mm,
we done that for the African child today, outside of just the Tinswalo,
mm,
who's the minority state in our nation?
mm. Right. So having said all of that and the fact that access, it's a very much was a thing, but how many of us literally are able to just, go through the system and just come out as successful as Edin Zwalo, for example. So in your view, how do we then rethink, mainstream education in South Africa? How do we then, design it in a way that it allows for the majority to benefit from it? How do we reimagine or rethink education, basic education in South Africa?
Balis, I'd love to answer that by saying that I don't think we've got a South African problem. I think we've got an African problem.
Mm,
And
okay.
I don't think South Africa needs to take this upon themselves. Yes, probably charity begins
Mm,
at home, but I think the conversation should be broadened
mm,
to the continent. The fact that Africa as a
mm,
continent, we know that colonialism was not just a South African issue, but it was a continental
mm,
issue. The fact that private or
mm,
higher education institutions in the continent are still run and administered, and the medium of instruction is still the colonial languages. In South Africa, obviously, our
mm,
two medium of instructions, we still have English and Afrikaans. From a higher education institutions, actually from grade 4 onwards going up. Mother tongue is only administered as an
mm,
instruction, a language of instruction in grade 1, 2, and 3. So, for me, I'm saying that as a
mm,
continent, can we just agree that we've got a problem, number one, because this colonial matrix of
mm,
power still holds on to us. It still grips us. It still chokes us. It still suffocates us
mm,
to this very day. And one way, and I'm making just a language as an example to say, when do we develop African languages to academic status? Take Afrikaans, for
mm,
instance. It was not an academic language, but when the Afrikaners came into power post 1948, 48 years, the one thing they ensured was to develop a language and make sure that they can be instructed in a language that they understand. Today, we've got English still
mm,
being a language, Alexandra Township, where we've got all the
mm,
other African languages that are predominant in that community. But when these kids get to grade 4, they must be instructed in English. And I'm asking really, how many
mm,
kids do not recover simply because they do not understand? And hence I'm saying it's an African
mm,
issue because Swahili is the most spoken of the predominant African language. But even Swahili is, people will speak, but I guess we'll have to ask the, scholars in Africa to say, how far are we with that agenda to say Swahili, can
mm,
we get that maybe as an African language and agree, or maybe continent as a, SADC, can we agree on a language that we will build and design? So I'm saying that we first need to, as a continent, say, where do we see ourselves within the next 100 years? But what do we need to do in the next 10
mm,
years to see that as a reality? Because we need to produce an African child that is a global citizen, that is able to compete globally. And we've got
mm,
everything that we need. We're not even going to go into the resources that
mm,
we hold as Africa, as a continent, as South
mm,
Africa, as
mm,
a country. But yet we just don't have the political power, perhaps. I don't think we've got the
mm,
academic intentions because we just
mm,
content, happy with the status quo simply because we possibly can classify ourselves as tin swallows. But my plea is really for all the other African kids that are unnamed, that are not on this platform, that will probably even never hear this webinar, but they are really the casualties of this education system that is still colonial
mm.
in nature.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. I think having touched on the political will now, I think I can just, ask Irfan to come in there to say, based on the caliber of leaders and leadership that we have currently, right? What kind of leaders do we need in order to ensure that such, systematic changes are are being implemented based on what Bafana is talking about? How do we ensure that the caliber of leaders is the one that we want? What kind of a leader or a leadership that are we looking for in as far as governance is concerned to implement such policies and, you know, rethinking as far as education is concerned?
No, thanks so much, Pelissa. And I think it's a fascinating discussion that's happening, and the inputs are really rich enough for further debate. I know we don't have much time, but
Yeah.
it is a very good conversation. I I mean, having been on the one end, so similar space to you, and now taking the shift into the arena of politics, I see a major problem in that the lack of political will isn't necessarily just we need a different set of leaders, but we need a set of leaders who have the capability, who have the experience and knowledge, and who also have the rootedness in the problem that exists. And so I say this because for many a time, and you see it each and every 2 weeks or a monthly, where you have somebody as a scandal, they've don't have their matric certificate, or the qualification they have is not legitimate. And these things are damaging to the governance systems, because what's happening is you putting people in places of position and influence who are making the wrong choices because they don't fully understand and comprehend the issues that are there. And one of the more glaring things is you have an education system in South Africa that's one of the biggest funded particularly in the continent, but unfortunately we're not seeing the results of. And so it bears the question of what is the leadership role in actually transforming the system, because it shouldn't be a norm where 4 out of 5 10-year-olds can't read for meaning. It can't read for meaning. And we want to compete in a global space. We want to, develop the Tinswalos who are able to, um, sweep the floor as far as the academics and the intellectual capacity. But if we can't get our 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds reading for meaning, we're basically destroying the future of not just those kids, but as the country as a whole. I think a big part of the reforms is attending to what's needed and not what's popular. For example, ECD reform is generally not a conversation we have in these discussions. Like now we're speaking about at least primary and tertiary education. But ECD is the fundamental for children to actually develop the skills and capacity to become lifelong learners. And unfortunately, in this country, we don't have a ECD system that's supported by government. Over the last few years, like the last 2 to 3 years specifically, you are seeing slight reforms. But the problem here in is that we are too slow in the implementation, and we're spending money willy-nilly that we don't actually just have much of. So for me, I think the transformation and the type of leaders we need are ones who have the experience and knowledge, but who also have the vision for what country we want to actually build. As it stands today, I think very few leaders are visionary in mind. Many are actually accessing. Sorry, I'm trying to deal with this light situation. Many are not focused on the developmental and transformative approach to leading. And so when they get in, they just take this authoritarian mode where it's what I say goes. I, for one, think that we have enough capacity in this country, specifically in the education space. You're seeing phenomenal people become chairs of UNESCO, et cetera, different committees. And it's because we are producing a good cohort of people who are academically sound. But those people are not contesting the arena for politics and or within the governance space. And that unfortunately is hindering our opportunity to grow the system into an equal one. Lastly, let me end off by saying I do think 30 years of democracy has prompted a harder conversation for the citizens of the country, the doctors, the people who have master's degrees, who have studied and who are equipped with the skills, the professionals who need to go into the public arena, because that's the value add that you can actually give to society, is that you have the knowledge and capacity. So what Bafana is alluding to is right, but you need to be able to be in the room to contest the space, so that we don't allow those who don't have that capacity and capability leading in the space.
Right. I have been challenged by your last point to say people with the skills, the knowledge, the degrees do not choose to contest in these arenas. So I am challenged in my own way. So thank you so much for bringing that. I'll think about it. But yeah, that's how we can actually impact these decisions, because we are pretty much, close to the problem. We know what it takes to to solve it. So therefore, what, just be part of the solution instead of just being a talker and just a critic in the benches. So yeah, I have been challenged by that. All right, Palisa, Bafana and Irfana alluding to the lack of focus within the basic education, and Irfan brings in the idea of the ECDs that has been neglected for the longest time, right? So based on the caliber of students that are entering institutions of higher learning, right, where is the gap between the students that are coming to universities and the ones that where is the gap between higher education institutions rather and basic education in terms of the caliber of students that are coming to institutions of higher learning?
Yeah, I think both of them mentioned the big challenge here. You know, Bafana mentioned that the students, the children actually are not reading for meaning. They are struggling, um, and when they're coming in at first year, that's where you actually see that, because the pace at higher education is much faster. You come in, you prepare, you teach, you provide additional material for the student to go and learn. There's a lot of self-learning that happens as well. Outside of the classroom, you see the students 3 times a week. If they're in the sciences, maybe there's a practical session, maybe 2 times a week. And that's, the
Yeah.
rest of the work is bore by the students. They have to actually go do the work themselves, prepare for the exams, and it's very intense environment. They're away from home. Some of them, it's like a big culture shock. You're away, it's the first time, you're in
Yeah.
another province, no parents, no control, no regulations, etc. So there's quite a lot of things that the students are challenged with when they arrived at the university. I think that there is the big gap between basic education and higher education, as well as, if one mentioned that at early career development, that's where the biggest challenge is. So you see those mathematics, those literacy, number skills, etc. All of those come back. And then what you find is also students try to find the quickest course, the easiest course, or whatever, how they advise each other. And then they end up, all applying for a similar type of degree. And whereas, when we do these career development workshops, we're always telling the students, and you can obviously not all the students, because if you go to certain schools, the students are not being taught mathematics, for example, so you can advise them on, STEM fields, etc., those kind of other courses. So you have to be really creative, but you can see that they're not looking at even post higher education. What's going to happen after I get this degree? And now what you
Yeah.
find them, they graduated, and then, the environment is saturated. We don't need those skill sets. And this, I'm giving this example because it seems that even us in higher education, we're not training the students with a vision of what will be needed in future. What are the jobs of the future? What are the skill sets of the future? Everybody's using computer now, digital technology, everything is digital, this and that and that. But 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we should have already started with digital literacy skills. at higher education even more, thinking ahead. We are competing with AI now,
Mm.
and did we even imagine this
Mm.
kind of world today? And so it just shows that there's this
Mm.
constant mismatch, miscommunication, misinformation, and also in terms of higher education. Additionally, is that once you pass through the undergraduate degree, I mean, now you need more than just the undergraduate degree. But once you pass through that undergraduate
Mm.
degree, postgraduate studies, what do you do when you do postgraduate studies? You're working on a thesis project, one thing,
Mm.
one single thing that you're working on. And by the
Mm.
time you finish it 3 years from now, maybe it's not even relevant. Even that topic is no longer relevant. So we're not equipping you any further with any
Ish.
other
Mm.
real world job readiness skill sets that you need, so that when you come out, you're not so dependent on just
Mm.
finding a job. You can get creative. You
Mm.
can get creative about the job systems that you might want to participate in, you might want to create when you come out of the university. And I
Mm.
know that there are some small interventions going on, but the reality is that we are not also preparing the learners for the future once they are in the higher education system. And Bafana is right. It's only a small percent who make it
Mm.
and stay, who get retained in the system, who become academics,
Yeah.
who get
Yeah.
retained, who get jobs when they leave. What about the rest who fall out? Universities now are only going back to start
Mm.
tracking,
Mm. Mm.
the students who are dropping out. Why did you drop out? Then it's
Mm.
financial issues, personal issues, etc. All these other things that a university may not focus on as a support mechanism. You
Mm.
provide the student with funding, but there's all other factors influencing the student. For example, some students
Mm.
come in, they get a bursary, but they are the only one in their family who's getting any kind of income. So now they get this
Mm.
bursary, and all the money is basically going back home. They're looking at after everybody, they're focusing on everything else, supporting everybody else. And now they still struggle through the system, even if they are funded. So it just shows that
Mm.
there are things people bring from home that add on the challenge. It's a very complex, it's a very complex situation, that
Mm.
requires not to for us to separate the three. Don't separate ECD
Yeah.
and basic and high. No, it's a whole pipeline. So what do we need to do
Yeah.
to support the whole pipeline? And what do we need to do to reform this higher education, like Bafana was saying? What do we need to do differently now? And I think that we
Mm.
need to take a little bit of time and go learn what other African countries are doing. Yes, they might not be on par with South Africa, with some of the,
Mm.
the, the
Mm.
systems that we have, but they're doing many, many things right. If you go to West
Mm.
Africa, there's still the apprentice system. The apprentice system,
Mm.
where, a child can finish matric. If they don't have money to go, they don't do the gap year, whatever. In fact, they go and spend time and
Mm.
learn things. They learn to fix cars, they learn to cook, they learn to sew, they learn to, and the people become
Mm.
self-sufficient. So what you find is that this really
Mm.
big formal economy going on, but at least people are not
Mm.
sleeping hungry. People have an income. People are living a dignified life, having some kind of income where they look after themselves with their own things that they've been able to create, because of this
Mm.
apprentice. So even if they're studying, they're doing zoology, they can sew, they can cook, they can. It's quite amazing to see, and I feel that we are missing out
Mm.
as South Africa by not learning what other countries are doing. They're still
Yeah.
following some of these hard systems because you still need scientists, so you need to follow the scientific
Yeah.
process. We don't say that we must
Yeah.
lose it, but we still need to follow that
Yeah.
process because you want to be a
Yeah.
scientist and you want to
Mm.
contribute and innovate, etc. And people are doing that
Mm.
differently now. You know,
Mm.
they're using indigenous knowledge systems and applying African, science, applying African science to process. So people are doing those
Mm,
things. So we still need
mm,
that process, but others we need to learn. We need to go back and see what others are doing and come back and implement. In terms of the policies, I think, Bafana, just to
yeah,
respond
yeah.
to you, I think in terms of the policies, at the beginning, I think the process was around, rectifying and opening up channels. And now I think it's the opportune time to start
Mm,
really reviewing and rewriting. That's what we need to do now. But the last 30 years, I think, really was spent a lot on corrective and change. And I think that some of the
mm,
policies have really worked. The NRF's DHEAD policies have really worked and have really transformed the academy
mm,
for what you can see it today. If you come, some universities won't take, it will take a long time for them to get to where they need to be,
yeah,
because of their very, very long history. Others, it will be
yeah.
faster, and newer universities will
Mm,
show you a better, more transformed picture of what a South African university should look like. We should be looking at Solplagi, University of Mpumalanga, Sefako Makgatho. We should
mm,
be looking at them, what they will look like in the next 10 years. And I assure you that those
mm,
emerging spaces are going to represent what we would like to see higher education look like in South Africa. For others,
yeah,
we're still going to take a little bit of time to get where we need to. So yeah.
yeah. Right. You are bringing in the idea of learning from other countries, as Bafana alluded to, the African problem, meaning that we need to look at this from a continental level, and obviously also from a leadership governance level as well. Now, and I like the idea of the interdisciplinary approach, because if I graduate with my B.Ed, then I go and be an apprentice for a mechanic, for example, it means that I'm expanding my knowledge in as far as other fields are concerned. Therefore, I'm increasing my opportunities of employment and also creating employment in that regard. So that was a very insightful discussion as far as this is concerned. And I know that time is really against us in terms of whatever else that we have to do post this, right? I think as a parting question now is, let me just start with you, Palisa, now to say, if you were the Minister of Higher Education, Science Development, within the higher education, what immediate, strategies or implementations would you do in as far as transforming or bring about change within the sector that you find yourself in? Minister, you have all the resources in your hands for a year at least. What are you implementing?
Okay, so well, firstly, because I've recognized one of the biggest gaps in the support system in research
Yeah,
in South Africa,
yeah.
which is lack of focus on young academics who just entered the system, who don't
Mm,
have money to do research, who don't have money to
mm,
supervise students, and yet
mm,
universities will come screaming and say they don't have supervision capabilities. And two
mm,
cohorts, one is postdoctoral research fellows, and one
mm,
is the young academics who are under 5 years as employed academics.
mm,
And those two people are the future pipeline for any
mm,
academic ecosystem in South Africa. So that's where
mm,
my first investment is going to go into. Firstly, with seed funding for research, for postdoctoral researchers and for our new academics,
mhm,
and then also
mhm,
student support, and then
mhm,
also capacity building programs focus on job readiness and digital
mm.
skills.
Love that. So that's where your vision is. First thing, first year, that's what you're implementing. We love that. And then Bafana, Minister of Basic Education for a year. Give us your plan, leader. Let's hear what is it that you would implement within the first year with all resources, all the funding, all powers given to you. Take it away. You are on mute. Let me see. Okay, let me just unmute you
Uh,
there. Now you can talk. Yeah.
Apologies for that. Yeah, we're still trying to unmute ever since COVID. So, number one, very controversial. I would wait for schools to close in December and I would fire all the teachers who are doing it. And for one reason, really, we've got about 5 weeks of holidays during December. After the firing, you would be allowed and
Mm-hmm.
permitted to reapply. And two things really would speak to you if you're a new applicant: competency and passion. And if you are a former teacher,
Okay.
three things for you: competency, passion,
Yeah.
and former results. And if those don't speak to it, chances are you'll not get your job, take your pension, go and retire somewhere, and use your money however you want to use it. And why such radical reform? And I think, I was shocked to find out that these statistics that we suffer with in basic education in terms of so many dropouts
Mm.
are actually identical within the PhD space. That out of every 15 PhD
Mm.
candidates, only about 7 to 8 actually graduate, which is troubling. But one of the
Mm.
factors that actually came about was the fact that, number one, people that actually need to supervise these PhD graduates or teach these learners in schools are not even passionate about what they do. They do it as a job. Like, it's really about getting paid
Mm.
at the end of the day. And I think there are other professions where you can do that, just not in education. Secondly, you find that they don't even like
Mm.
people. So they don't like kids. They don't like the
Mm.
people they deal with. How don't you even love your first stakeholder, the primary client that you're dealing with?
Mm.
And then thirdly, and I think this is the
Mm.
sad part for me, there is no accountability for whether people produce results or not. So if I'm a teacher in school, I did grade 6 mathematics for
Mm.
most of my life. If half of my kids fail, I'm still going to get paid month end. I'm still going to be retained in the system for
Mm.
as long as I want to be in the system. And
Mm.
apparently, it's the same even for PhD
Mm.
supervisors. If their candidates don't complete, no one holds them accountable and say, you're not going to get paid for this or that. So whether you produce results or not, you're still compensated for it. And I think that's, yeah, I'm trying to use words that are friendly here, but that's really absolute rubbish. So that's what I would do as a minister, number one. And I think number two then is to bring
Mm.
about intentionality. I think as a country, we lack intentionality. We are a wounded nation politically, economically, socially, and obviously, most
Mm.
importantly, academically or educationally. And we need to be intentional. What is it that we want to achieve? Where do we see ourselves? Outside of clouds of colonial
Mm.
apartheid, where do we see ourselves? Be intentional about that and then use the resources that we have. And these resources definitely starts with the natural resources we have as a country, from the platinum to the diamonds to the gold.
Mm.
How do we use these resources
Mm.
to be able to transform a nation of South Africa so that it benefits every child in South Africa? Thank you.
Mm. Thank you so much. Irfan, your turn now. Are you still with us?
I'm quite excited, but I have so much to add.
Yeah.
I
Tell us your vision, yeah, your vision as a leader to say, today I'm a minister of youth development and governance, doing something very progressive. You have 1 year to do that. What are those things
thank
that are
you. I think
implemented immediately?
specifically because I don't believe that ministry. I don't think the Ministry of Youth is actually adding value. So I'll focus it on my
Yeah.
approach as a minister of basic education. I'll make
Yeah.
ECD universal and support
Mm.
existing ECD centers in communities that are
Mm.
community run, or create new ones
Mm.
available in every community, open between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. Primarily because we have a crisis where
Mm.
single mothers or single parents in general can't access or support or go and look for work
Mm.
because of the problems that exist. So ECD centers, every community,
Mm.
and ensure a state of disaster is implemented immediately so that we deal with the crisis of pit latrines. Another kid was died just last week because of drowning in one. So
Mm.
making sure we remove pit latrines and do so within a year It's impossible. Like this thing
Yeah.
of dragging it on year is not helping anyone. Standardized assessments for reading at primary level. But this is
Yeah.
must be within a generational focus. So 2025 year program in mind. So even if I'm not a minister in 5 years, the program must continue and bear the results of ensuring all our kids in this country are literate and I have the requisite skills. I also, like Bafana, be quite heavy-handed on firing school leaders and bureaucrats that are corrupt. I don't think we can have a system in place where there are graduates who are in education and related fields who are unemployed, whereas also we have people in the system who don't have the education or even a safety clearance, which is damaging and dangerous. As we can see, the rate of violence in our schools is also too high. I'll implement a regional sports league so that every region has a dedicated sports league of not just football, but of all sports, particularly to make it inclusive for all genders. And to speak about physical education, because it's not about just sports, it's about being physically active to be healthy. On the question of health, I'll make it mandatory for all public schools to grow food gardens. So that also adds and supplements into the nutritional program, but also that communities benefit because the hunger crisis in this country is too high for us to go about as a normal society. I'll invest heavily in redesigning the structure of your school. So curriculum around civic arts and cultural education. But this is specifically to the point around what learner do we want to produce, what person do we want to produce post the schooling years, who has a view of patriotism, the civic mindedness, who wants to contribute to building the country. And so there's a deepening of civic arts and cultural education. Also for supplementary support, things like mental health and healing, those subjects help with that type of problem. I'm going to end here, I promise. I know I can speak for longer, but it's impossible to grow a healthy society and a healthy system when half of the learners who enter school are exiting before they finish matric. This has many repercussions, and I think from a productive perspective, we need to make sure every learner finishes their education. Those that don't, you can see the levels of unemployment that exist because they don't have something as simple as a matric. And so the 40 to 50% young people who are dropping out need to be retained in schools, and therefore redesigning a school system that also is enforced on a skills basis so that the productivity of our learners and our citizens increases post matric. And so your readiness to go and will find work and get a job is higher than just actually going through the same matric system that we currently have.
Yeah.
I'll leave it there because I don't want to go on, but
Yeah.
hopefully post the 29th,
No,
I'll be
those are
able
beautiful
to sit
plans.
in a
Yeah.
committee.
Please, because what I'm listening to each and every one of you speak, I'm like, you know what? If I am elected tomorrow, I know who to talk to because you've committed to this plan. So I know that Bafana is very big on decisiveness, and you'll be like, you know what? You're all fired. Policy and policies in higher education, I like that. And what you bring in terms of the skills based as well, we need that. We need to ensure that our graduates actually from basic education level that they can find employment, if not they can create employment. So I know that you are my people, so I can hold you accountable to that regard, in that regard, and it's on record, by the way. So please ensure that in your own spaces you are starting to just move with this implementation so that going forward we build a more livable South Africa, if anything. Any last words before we dismiss? And then I just, I let you guys go and be busy with your very busy life and intentional lives of making a difference. Are there any last word? Anybody can take this really if you have any last words, and then we can just close it off.
Thank you so much for hosting
Thank you
us.
so
I
much
think these conversations are useful. An hour is not enough to go and engage, but I
Mhm.
think We must continue opening up space for this discussion. And if anyone wants to engage, please feel free to follow me and connect through Palissa. And let's build organizations like Edtech Bridges so that we can keep these conversations going.
Thank you so
And
much.
make sure everyone's
I appreciate
voting, regardless of who.
Just vote. Just vote. Thank you, Irfan. Yes, Bito.
No. I just wanted to say thank you very much for the opportunity. I think it's been a great conversation, and we need more of these. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Bafana Mohali.
Ma'am, thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists, Palisa or Dr. Palisa. Thank you so much for your input, your passion within the higher education space. Irfan, thank you so much, sir, for your wise words there in leadership. And I think my parting shot really would be to the South African, the South African academia, the South African middle class, to say we are all in instrumental spaces. And I just want to echo the words of Professor Jonathan Jansen, who said we need to be drivers of change. And we need to sometimes make the hard decision not to drive the BMW, but to drive the change. So let us keep on driving the change in South Africa.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much. Right. Alrighty, and that's how we come to the end of this very important conversation and discussion. Thank you so much to Dr. Mutabo, to Bafana Mohali and Irfan for their insight in as far as this conversation is concerned. Sure that you keep us up to date in as far as how you found this conversation. Any questions that you have, please post them and then we'll respond as soon as we can. Until we meet again, it's bye for now.